Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Hello and welcome to India Colonized, a podcast dedicated to South Asia's modern and contemporary history. You are listening to Guftagu, a special series where we discuss and engage with authors and scholars of South Asian history. In this episode of Guftagu, we have with us Dr. Jessica Namakkal, author of the book Unsettling Utopia, Making and Unmaking of French India. Dr. Jessica Namakkal is an assistant professor of the practice in international comparative studies, history, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University. Jessica Namakkal's Unsettling Utopia gives us a new version of 20th century French India's history. It demonstrates how colonial developments continued even after official decolonization kicked in. The book presents to analyze the colonial histories of the Aurobindo Ashram and Orville, demonstrating how state-sponsored decolonization is rarely associated with local demands. She suggests that their ongoing growth reveals how decolonization unfortunately resulted in new settling spaces which ended up preserving colonial control. This book puts into question the long-held scholarly argument on the time and place of decolonization. Unsettling Utopia rightly puts the spotlight on colonialism's legacies and provides striking thoughts on what decolonization might yet involve. This interview explores and examines provided stances in the book, along with other broader perspectives on decolonization. Here's the conversation with Dr. Jessica Namakkal.
Hello, Dr. Jessica Namakkal. Hello, and welcome to India Colonized and the series of Guftagu. Today, we'll be engaging with your book, Unsettling Utopia, The Making and Unmaking of French India. Well, before we can actually start to discuss about the book, I had a couple of biographical questions. The first of which is, what is the kind of intellectual journey that you had? If you could tell us about your intellectual journey, the books that influenced you, people who've influenced you in taking up. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Omar. It's such a great project to be involved with. So my intellectual journey, I have a PhD in history from the University of Minnesota. I became interested, I would say I've been interested in history my whole life. But one of the things I try to do in my work is really make academic history a little bit more accessible. You can be the judge if that works or not. But because I think there really is a sometimes very problematic divide between what is sort of seen as public history or more popular history and academic history. And obviously what happens in the academy is so important. People have more resources a lot of the time to be going to archives. Something I really highlight in this book is that to study French India, you have to be able to travel to archives all over the world, right? And that takes money and it takes time. So that's one of the reasons that academic history becomes sort of the focal point. But, history is important to all of us. I think it's a discipline that we, people, no matter if they've gone to university, no matter their level of education, have some sort of relationship to. So, I went to undergraduate at the University of Southern California and actually went there for film school, wanted to be a documentarian, ended up doing some anthropology. And in anthropology, I actually became really disillusioned with academia sort of in general, because, when you study the history of anthropology, you just see how deeply rooted colonialism is in all academic disciplines. But anthropology, so explicitly so, And the discipline has done a lot to sort of confront this over the years. But I became really interested in the history of anthropology, and that led me to be interested in the history of state making, colonialism, empire, knowledge production. So that's sort of where I started. I didn't go directly into graduate school. I worked in museums for a few years. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I don't know if this will be interesting to your listeners, but I decided to go into a PhD program largely because I just wanted to read and write and be taken seriously while doing so. And it's a place where you can do that. I was listening to some other episodes of India Colonized and noted, people pointing out how bad the academic job market it is, and it's terrible. And what I actually tell my students is, if you want to read and write and think and need the space to do that and won't be devastated if you don't get a job as a professor, and it's still a good place to go to graduate school. And that's honestly what I did. I just wanted to be able to do that. And I went in thinking I would study empire. I wasn't too sure where. One of my mentors at the University of Minnesota, Patricia Lorson, is a French historian whose first book is in Algeria, and sort of noted that there had been less people working on Francophone empire than on British empire. My father is from Secunderabad, India, so I had this relationship to India already, and so started also working in South Asian history, and just found the field so exciting and interesting. So I sort of ended up we're looking on French India because I was working with someone who worked on France, and then was also working with someone who's a part of the Subaltern Studies Collective, that's Ajay Skaria at Minnesota. And so by working with both of them, I ended up working on French India. So that brought me to the location. But it was really more the themes that I was looking at than the location itself.
All right, that's wonderful. I mean, we one of the things that we try to discuss with people on our podcast is definitely the idea of how difficult academia can be, and also deconstructing the whole academic approach, basically breaking it down to youngsters and other people to get them interested to work, because it's kind of like an ivory tower that, it's just for the academicians, and then there's only the two different. Popular history is different and academic history is different, which is kind of the gap that this project is also trying to fill in. So could you tell us, our audience, a bit about the theme of your book, the theme that your book explores?
Yeah, there's the book is about French India. Most of what has been written about French India tends to focus on the early empire, right? So I think the number one question people have is, what was France doing in India? Well, they were doing the same thing everybody else was doing in India, right? In the 17th century, they were starting to trade. My book looks at the 20th century largely, and I'm really interested in decolonization. And so that was my starting point with the book. It became sort of about something much more. And that's because, there's, speaking of a split between popular understandings of things and academic understandings of things, sort of this tension between work that's done in post-colonial studies, in what is called decolonial studies, and then you have the actual histories of decolonization, right? Of what happened as groups of people fought for independence from colonial rule. So I set out sort of to be working within these academic fields of post-colonial studies and decolonial studies, but to also be looking at decolonization. And those things actually don't always go together. So I was working to bring them all together because I think one of the things the book is really trying to do is to show that no matter where you are in the world, decolonization is an ongoing process. And it's an event that was not completed. And some sort of political histories and work by political scientists of the era, but also political histories, have treated decolonization as an event that is finished. Right. India's independence, 1947. The Constitution in 1950. We're good. Right. Now everything is India's problem. Right. So, which, to some extent is true, but there's so much left out of the story. So that's one of the themes, and one of the way that I go about doing this, and this gets us to the title of Unsettling Utopia, is to think about the different populations that came to dominate life in really Pondicherry. French India is actually 5 different areas, and I really concentrate on Pondicherry, the largest, with a good amount of detail, to Chandanagar up in Bengal, but mostly those 2. And there are things to be said about the other areas, but and the reason I do it is because just something, life was different there than in other parts of colonial India, and in a way that I think is really interesting. So the utopia in the title actually refers to multiple conceptions of utopia. And one is that of the people who lived under French colonial rule in India, who were largely Tamil, but also Bengali, and also, well, identities changed, but also had other linguistic and cultural affiliations. Was that people were allowed to become French citizens beginning in 1881. And some, a good amount of people did. And this is just the attachment that people formed to France was very different than what happened in British India, right? Because England never offered people citizenship, and they didn't, people weren't citizens in England either. Right. So it's this different conception of what it meant to belong. And this comes from the French Revolution. And France really propped itself up as sort of a utopian space, right, of civic participation, right, of individual liberty. And people were sort of given rights that they weren't given in other parts of colonized India, right? So there's this idea that France is this liberated space, and we see what happens when people go there. But, that plays pretty well for the French in French India for a certain amount of time. So that's one sense of utopia. And then the other sense of utopia is the utopian ideals formed by the Sri Aurobindo ashram, and then eventually Orville, which is a project that comes out of the ashram, established in 1968. And the ashram and Orville are both projects that include Europeans, primarily beginning in the ashram with a woman named Mira Alfassa, or the mother, who's French, but lots of other people that come to live there, and then people from Greater India as well who come there and sort of see the space of French India as a place to experiment and do some other things. And we can get into that if you want to, but those are the 2 different sort of ideas of utopia that are being formed, and they're both related to something of a French republicanism. Right. And so my argument is that all utopian ideas have material consequences, and that we should look at what those material consequences are for the good and for the bad. Right. And so that's sort of what the unsettling is about there.
Well, that's quite interesting. And we'll try covering quite parts of those the ideas of utopia. Questions. So coming to the next question, what was the approach and methodology that you applied in this work, and how was it different than what is existing in that space, and how much work, like even academically, how much attention has been paid of French colonialism and especially the idea of French space in India?
Yeah, again, most of the work is on earlier time periods. Part of that, what I saw and what I argue is part of that is because sort of once 1947 happens, everything else gets subsumed under that. So in histories of decolonization of India, which is really, histories of independence, there's not really a movement for decolonization. It's an independence movement. French India gets just woven into the story, and it's really it seems like a predetermined end, right? That it's obvious that these areas will become part of India. Even Nehru spoke like this, like, just be patient, we'll come get you. But people were really actively debating joining the French Union, which is much like the British Commonwealth. This idea put forth by the French for the Constitution of the Fourth Republic, that people should be able to join this federation, this Federated Union of France. So there's a lot of debates about what the future actually looks like. And that just hadn't really been covered at all. So I went in to look at that. But, if that's sort of my starting point, I go then, forward and backwards in history to get there. And, so in terms of methodology, historians are funny about method, but I'd place my work somewhere as a combination of political and cultural history. And I've also really been greatly influenced by work in human geography. I mean, space is really important to this history, right? Because the 5 territories of French India are so spread out, but also because they are fractured, especially Pondicherry, within its own space. So I really drew on works of people who have theorized space and what that means to mobility and migration. So there's it's interdisciplinary in that sense, I would say.
Yeah. So what were the kind of limitations that you hit, especially in cases of archival material, or was really there something that you came across, maybe a post-publication that you wanted to include, or, because it is kind of an ongoing process. So were you able to stumble on something that could have added to the narrative of the book? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to cover a lot of ground in the book, in that sense, you can go sort of the micro history route or sort of more of an expansive view. And I straddle the line a little bit, but I think, I would, if I were to make this twice as long or something, I think there's much more to be said about the sort of voices of people who lived in these areas, right? I have some of it, but it's mostly political leaders. Right, it's big names. It's the leaders of political parties, right? So there's not that much about sort of what life was like for women in Pondicherry. I would love to find more sources about that. I think so much also of this, what happens and has happened post 1962, when the French were officially out of India, had to do with educational systems, and that isn't something I focused on at all. But I think, looking at how schools developed from sort of the French convent schools to what happens with the ashram schools and then eventually the Orville schools is actually an incredibly interesting question that I would love to know more about. And, the limit, in terms of my own limitations, I mean, part of it is time and resources, but I worked primarily in multiple archives in France, including the colonial archives in Aix, of course, the British Library, in the India office, and then in the Pondicherry State Archives and the Orville Archives. I think that if I went to Chennai and looked at the police records there, I probably would get also a greater sense of the Tamil, anti-colonial Tamil people who were hiding out in Pondicherry. I think there's a lot more to be said about them and interesting projects there. But so there's all kinds of things that could be added in here. But I will say one thing that started as a dissertation, which I finished in 2013. And a lot of the decolonization files from the French side didn't open until 2014. So so the book has those because I went back after the dissertation and did more research. That's because it didn't happen that long ago, right? And there's, these years placed on them when they can be declassified. So I actually got them right when they opened. And I think that trip was 2015 that I did that. So I got those, all of the sort of police files that I have in there weren't open while I was dissertating. So time can make a big difference when doing more recent historical research.
Yeah, definitely. So, were there things that you were not able to include because of publication limitations that you wanted to
Yeah, I had a lot of really, really great images that were all from newspapers, mostly the Hindu, but and I just couldn't get the rights to publish them. My favorite one is a photo taken in 1953 on the border between French India and Pondicherry in India. And something that happened right after India's liberation in 1947 is that in French India, they banned protests. They just saw what was going to happen, right? Partly because of people that lived in French India, but as the cover of the book shows, there's the borders for French India often were just rows of stones that went through villages, right? So they knew that even people on the other side might start agitating for liberation, for inclusion in the Indian Union. So they banned protests. So what happens is you get these huge manifestations and people gather at the border and then yell into French India, right? So I actually have a picture of this from the Hindu. It's 1952 or 1953. And you can it's just a huge crowd of people, and it's so far back you can't see. And then the line that's holding them back is French Indian police, right? And they're sort of acting as the border there. So there is like a lot of visual representation of some of the issues I talk about that I couldn't get permission to use. For the chapter that's about people going to moving to Paris, right? I if I had time, I would have loved to do oral histories with the diaspora, and I just had to limit the project somewhere. That I didn't. Yeah, this isn't because I didn't have publication rights, but But I also think that would be incredibly interesting to engage with more.
I think, that's actually one of the things that I've been thinking of asking authors while during these conversations is, I think one aspect that is rarely covered is the difficulty of getting the work published.
Yeah.
I think that is not often talked about. It's like one of those dark things, like how academia is not, you cannot afford your life probably in being in academia is one of the things that is not largely talked about, that getting your work published and what does it take to publish in a quality publication house, and getting your work accepted and everything. But I mean, if you're okay with it, this is the first time we're asking the question on the show. If you want to talk about what was it like getting your work published?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these projects take such a long time, right? So again, I defended this dissertation, I guess, in December 2012. And so it just came out in 2021, right? Some of that was life things, having a baby and things like this. But, also it was doing this additional research, having time to write the new research into it, revising basically the whole thing, workshopping the new parts with people. I'm at Duke University, a very well-resourced university that did things like had a manuscript workshop for me, where I got to bring in scholars to comment on it, which is great. It also means more revisions after that. And the way I'm happy to talk about it. The way it worked for me, my book is at Columbia University Press in the Global and International History series, which is a series co-edited. And one of the co-editors, Jamil Aydin, Aydin, is great. I know him because he's local at UNC Chapel Hill and has just been a great mentor and helped get this book to publication. So he came to that workshop. He put me in touch with the editors at Columbia. And then it goes out for review. You finish it, you send it, they send it to reviewers. Several months go by, you get feedback, you revise again, and then finally they give you a contract. Yeah. And it works a little bit differently, but that's generally how it works. Some presses have another layer of peer review on it. And it can not make it through the peer review stage. It can make it, and then after that, there's more, it goes to copy editors, it goes to page proof. So it's a long process. But I did do it through someone, like I didn't cold call an editor, but that is something you can do. And I know lots of editors who say you should, right? Especially if you have sort of a manuscript already, to send emails. Not calls, emails to ask. But it is, to the listeners and viewers, it's just really important to actually look at their press and see if they're publishing work like yours. Right.
Mhm.
I think it's so important to just look at your bookshelf or, the books that you've read and really admired and look at who's publishing them. Right. Because that is a press that's going to take your work seriously. And that, people who are reading these other books then might stumble across yours because it's their, when it's a series like this, it can be part of a bigger intellectual project to build,
Yeah.
in this case, global history.
Definitely. So let's start on questions about the book itself. So one of the questions we had was the image of British imperialist in comparison to the French imperialist. Like, in this image of quote unquote good imperialists, and what were the contradictions in this image of the good imperialist. So if you can break that down for the sake of our audience, yeah.
Sure, of course. So, India, of course, was a very important colony to the British. I think that doesn't need to be explained. France really lost any chance of having more control in South Asia by the end of the 19th century. No, sorry, end of the 18th century. So, during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, Pondicherry went back and forth. Pondicherry is very close to Chennai. So, as the British were building up there in the 1700s, the French really thought maybe they had a chance to battle with them for the area. And all these hopes were gone. Pondicherry became what it was in 1814. And when it was signed back over in one of the Treaty of Paris, they agreed to never have a military presence. So the idea of greater power was gone by 1814, right? They could have a police, but that was it. So what do you do, right? Why does France continue to have India is the question. And other people, Jyoti Mohan in her book, oh gosh, what's it called? Imagining India. I feel really bad if I got that wrong. You can look that up. Talks about, the idea of India was sort of a failed empire for the French. But it was because India was so important and because, France doesn't really start expanding into what is known as their newer colonies until after this point. So, it's 1838 is when they occupy Algeria. It's not until much later, decades later, that they go into Indochina. So India, they're having a presence in India means they sort of still have a foot in the game, right? As they start to do more expansion. And it's always sort of used as a trading piece for the French. So in all of these deliberations, diplomatic discussions in the 19th century, there's sort of well, we'll trade you this piece in Morocco for this piece in South India, so it's sort of a bargaining chip. Now that's at a diplomatic level. So what was, life like for people on the ground? I already mentioned this question of citizenship. And this is such a difference because you can see it so clearly. The difference between the French and the British colonial systems just becomes so acutely clear in India because you can see them next to each other, right? Otherwise, it's a little bit abstract. And of course, France is doing everything possible to make sure Muslims in North Africa don't become French citizens, right? Mm-hmm. So they're passing all kinds of laws, but then it's but we can do these things in India, and it'll show how good we are, right? So there is a degree of calculation there. And how this will help them look good, and that visibility is actually very important, right? Because the colonial proxy wars we see in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century are almost always between France and England. Some other states get in there sometimes, but they're really battling it out globally. So you do have French Indians becoming citizens, and that means they vote. That means that they have different property rights. That means that they have this idea that they could move to France and just fully integrate there. And that's actually, most people can't do that because of resources. But, this is compared to British India, which has things like, a color line for advancement in the Indian civil service. And this is like Aurobindo, was studying for the Indian civil service exam in England when he realized he could never become a high rank because of his skin color. And that's what led him to be against the British Empire. Right. And, there is plenty of racism going on with the French, but they have this colorblind policy of the colorblind republic. So it's a way of sort of playing it off, and you don't actually get the consequence of it very often because people just can't travel to France. It's very far away. People don't have the money to do that. So by the time independence comes, then it becomes a much bigger question of what's going to happen next.
So while you're talking in your book, you portray a kind of hierarchy that existed within the utopic experiment of Orville.
Mm-hmm.
But before we can talk about that placement or the hierarchy in Orville, if you could tell us a bit about Aurobindo and Orville to basically contextualize this part.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just mentioned Aurobindo. And for those who don't know, Aurobindo Ghosh, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, often known as, was an incredibly well-known freedom fighter. Right. He was Bengali. He was born in an Anglophile family. So I think from about age 5, he attended English medium schools. His father spoke English to him. He was sent to England young to attend a school. He was, he was doing all of his training in Greek and Latin and classics. And doing quite well, right? He was a gifted student. He was doing the whole thing on his way to be a great Indian civil servant. And as I mentioned, the story is that he failed the equestrian exam on purpose so that he would sort of be free. And he decided, this was the early 20th century, and this is just after the partition of Bengal, when he decides, I'm going to go fight for the liberation of India from England. So he turns from a sort of a privileged Anglophile into this. He goes back to India. He's an educator. He has a newspaper, that the British are targeting under the seditious materials laws. And he gets involved with these struggles for independence. Mostly he moves around. He's in Baroda for a while. But he's mostly sort of in the north. And in 1910, he had been in and out of courts. He became wanted in by the British authorities in the Alipore bombing case, where a judge had been bombed. And he takes this opportunity to go to Chandernagore, which is one of the French territories just outside of Calcutta. And he gets on a ship and he sails to Pondicherry, right? And that's in 1910, and he never leaves. He passes away in 1950. So he spends the next 40 years in Pondicherry, right? So when he gets there in 1910, he's this really, really important political figure, right? And people start, they come to visit him. He goes there because it's safe from British jurisdiction, again, to see the difference between the areas. Like there truly are differences in these very small amounts of space, right? That the British police are not allowed to come in and get him. And the French are surveilling him, right? But they hold strong against the British forces and say, no, you can't come in here. And, others start to come to visit him. And within a few years, he decides he is going to devote his life to yoga and to philosophy. And he sort of retreats. And there's a lot to say there. There's a great book called The Lives of Sri Aurobindo by Peter Heath that I recommend to people to read. And the other key person in this, someone I mentioned, a woman named Mira Alfassa, who comes to Pondicherry in 1914 with her then husband, Paul Richard, who was a French colonial administrator. And they come and in Paris, they had already been involved in the occult and were interested in things like theosophy. So they're very interested in Aurobindo before they come to Pondicherry, but they get stationed there, and they come and start to work with Aurobindo quite quickly. So the ashram isn't actually founded until 1926, but there is, they're living in a house. Alfasa and Richard have to leave because of the war. They go to Japan. They come back after the war, and that is the moment where Mira comes to Pondicherry and never leaves again. So she's there until her death, and now I can't remember, 73 or 74. And the other thing I'll say there's a lot to say about this history. But the thing I'll say right here, and that's important to me in this study, is what does their presence do to Pondicherry? And that's my question. And if you've been to Pondicherry, you know that it is split into, it's really, a very small area that's right on the sea, which was at the time called White Town, or the Ville Blanche. And then the rest of Pondicherry is the Ville Noire, the Black Town. So we already see a color line there. And that line is actually a sewage canal. So it's a very smelly line. And so if you've been there, you'll know that the White Town, which now on the map says Heritage Town, is very nice, right? French style architecture. You have just, grid-like streets, everything's clean, all of the resources. I mean, of course, 2021 is a lot different than then, but that is when that area really sort of became a center point. And the ashram owns a lot of the property there, right? So that starts around this period where they start to acquire property. So some of it is, guest houses for the ashram, but, I think they own a gas station. For a long time in Pondicherry, they were the only place that owned a car. Right. So they become really this like center of first of all, it's enclosed, right? It's because you have to be sort of let into the ashram. There is some oversight of who's being let in. And it's also very close to the French consulate. Right. So the other things that are in that area are the French government buildings. I mean, today the consulate, but, the city hall and all of these places. So, all of the governors who governed in French India, they really relied on the ashram to sort of give them information and to work with them. So, the ashram always said they were apolitical. That was their thing. We don't do politics, right? Even though Aurobindo was this huge figure, he would say, like, I think everybody should be free. Like, of course, India should be liberated. But, now we're interested in evolution of the human mind and body. That was sort of their thing in a practice called integral yoga. So they have this what I argue is they have this real connection with the French government, right? India's independent in 47, Aurobindo passes away in 1950, and the mother starts to focus, more and more people are living in the ashram. The mother starts to focus more on this project that she calls Orville. So, her and Aurobindo and the mother thought of this together, but it's really her project. And, everything happens after he passes away. So, he to the people there, he remains an important force, but it's really I also didn't say that it's around 1926 where people start calling her the mother also. So Alfasa becomes the mother. And the idea is to acquire some land and create what they call an experiment in living, right? This utopian community that would be devoted to what they call the divine, which is, or the divine consciousness, which is ideas that are integral to the mother and Aurobindo's sort of way of bringing about unity and peace on earth. Okay, there's a lot more to say about that. People actually work on their thought, which is sort of not my number one thing, but okay. So Orville is founded in 1968. So that's 18 years after Aurobindo passes, right? Quite a bit of time. Pondicherry and the four of the French territories are officially free from France in 1962, although they had agreed to leave in 1954. Okay, so 68 then Orville is established. And it's really seen by the mother and people in the ashram as a little bit less of an ascetic spiritual space than the ashram is, which is really devoted to a life of study. And Orville is actually meant to be a functioning city. So, it's envisioned as to look like a galaxy. It's supposed to have a monorail. It doesn't have a monorail. It's supposed to have all of these universities and experiments in ecology and like forest preservation and organic farming and industry. So some of that has lasted, or has come through, and some of it just was never. I mean, they wanted to have 50,000 people. And they've, for the past 2 decades, they've been between 2,000 and 3,000. And part of this is because they can't acquire any more land, which is, I think, getting, after a very long time, to your question about hierarchy in Orville, which is that, it's interesting. Orville is not in Pondicherry. Parts of it are, little parcels of it actually are, because in 1962, after the French have left, the boundaries of French India remain in place today, except for Chandigarh, which voted to join the Union in 49. The rest of the boundaries in all of the 4 territories remain today as governed under the Union territory of Pondicherry. So they're actually governed at the federal level. They're not part of their surrounding states. So if you look on a Google map, you can actually see the little parts that are in Pondicherry. But most of the land was then purchased from farmers and villagers in Tamil Nadu, right? So it's interesting because, again, the space becomes so important here because, the other thing that happened on these borders, right, between India and French India and British India is that there were factories that the British and the French ran, and workers sort of had to cross the border to go to work there. Right. So there was always this sort of sense of both mobility and sort of a lack of mobility going on between these spaces. It makes space seem very visible in a way it isn't otherwise, because you have like fences in places where you wouldn't expect a fence, right? Or you have just these borders. You need beginning in sort of the 1930s, you need an identity card to cross the village, right? So people start to like be surveilled and seen in ways they hadn't been seen before. So, Orville comes in 68, and the people that come sort of act like colonialism is very far in the past, right? This is the future. This is about newness. Everybody gets to sort of benefit from this project. But what you just have is sort of basic dispossession, right? They come in, they buy land very cheap from people, and then they create this society that people can't join, right? And one of the reasons is because they need to hire them as laborers. Right. There's a huge emphasis in sort of popular remembering of Orville about how the people came from the West and other parts of India. It's not just Westerners to build Orville. And then, if you look at the remembrances and the oral histories, you have all of these French and German and Italians and Americans saying, yeah, we got there and it was super hot and it looked really hard. And then we realized we could hire these women from the village for like nothing. It was pennies to us, right? I mean, one of the descriptions says you could hire these ammas and they looked like ants, right? Just horribly colonial, dehumanizing language. But it's, there might be some regret about it today, but it didn't stop anything, right? So as well, and this has continued, right? The local people are the laborers in Orville, right? And so, it creates this hierarchy that I think you're asking about, right? That a lot of people, I mean, the other reasoning you get from people is just like half of Orville is Indians. Well, okay, but who are they? Right. And almost none of them are local. And I know everyone who listens to your program knows that, India is an incredibly diverse place. And to have people coming from Bombay and have people come from Delhi and all of these places, and then just sort of say, oh, we're Indians. We're like, this is our native space in rural Tamil Nadu. It's like, no, it's really not. So what does that say about actually decolonization? What does that say about the making of modern India, right? Okay. I talked so long there also.
No, so one of the questions also was in this understanding of hierarchy, what was the kind of influence of the caste system, if there was even any? So, like, how was caste system playing a role here?
In Pondicherry, I have a good answer for that. In Orville, less so. But for Pondicherry, the prospect of French citizenship was very important for low caste and Dalit peoples, right? And this is, we can see similarities in British India for people of low caste and Dalit peoples who converted to Christianity. And you actually see that a lot in French India too, that a lot of the Catholic conversions are people who are sort of trying to get out of caste, right? And what happens, and this is, starting when the citizenship, people say, oh, well, I can be French, then I won't be part of this anymore, right? And of course, local, high caste not just Brahmins, but upper caste Hindus in Pondicherry didn't want to have anything to do with this. And so sort of used the courts to continue segregationist policies. So, in the Catholic churches, you immediately saw sections being set up for, this is the outcast section so even if you now had a French name and your whole family had taken on French citizenship, like nobody allowed you to not be seen within your caste limits. So again, really similar to what happens in British India with religious conversion. I think, around independence, there's somebody I talk about in the book named Dadala, who was a low caste man who worked for the French police out of, he was in Yanam is where he, one of the other territories in Andhra. And he's one of the people that really spoke of France as a potential utopian space. Even though he fought for the independence of India, of French India, he then after independence sort of said, I fought for this, but now I realize that I am so oppressed in India because of my caste that, this is actually not my homeland. So maybe France is my homeland. And I don't think he ever moved there. I couldn't trace him much after his memoir, but it seems like he stayed in India. But he really sort of longed for France, thinking that it would be a place where he could finally be free of caste.
So, that's great. I just wanted to discuss a bit about the image of Aurobindo and its association with the idea of Orwell. Well, we had early prime ministers visiting Orwell, and in that instance of prime ministers of India visiting Orwell, was there a sense of communal atmosphere that was prevalent, and was it in any case a political strategy of them visiting that?
Yeah, so Orville was really, really committed to gaining international backing. So before they even broke ground, they worked really hard to be recognized by UNESCO, right? So they wanted to get the support of sort of an international community because their whole thing is to be an international township. Which, it's interesting. There's a very interesting tension in Orville because they were really part of the sort of 1960s global citizen movement. And some of this actually stems from the issues that the ashram, this will be about prime ministers, I promise, that the ashram, people living in the ashram had around independence was that, they had been living there under a colonial India. They had to figure out how they could stay, right? Because they weren't Indian citizens. So how are they going to stay? They no longer sort of had the blanket approval to live there that they was given them with whatever, imperial citizenship that they had. And, this is the, 1940s, 1950s. This is really the era where citizenship rights come into being in a lot of ways. So, there's the campaigns, letter writing campaigns in the ashram before the independence of French India, lobbying Nehru to allow dual citizenship. Right? They want to be able to be French and Indian at the same time, mostly for residency purposes. But it takes on more of a, I'd say, almost spiritual quality, right? Where they say sort of, I belong to India. I clearly belong here. Yet I also this is what the mother would say. I'm also of France, right? And I love the French language and history and language, and I'm a part of all of this. So I really am a dual person, right? So Nehru said no to all of this. But so they, and they had kind of lost out on dual citizenship. So it became sort of an international thing, right? We don't, nobody belongs anywhere. And the tension comes in where Orville is actually organized around the idea of national cultures. So within Orville, you have all of these pavilions, and the pavilions are based on national cultures, like a French pavilion, an Indian pavilion, a Spanish pavilion, right? So it actually is this idea that there are certain attributes that are related to what become national cultures. So it's sort of this idea, it's really kind of the idea of modern India in a way. It's like the unity and diversity, right? Idea. So they, they ask UNESCO for support. They get Nehru to come to Orville and the ashram. They get Indira Gandhi. Part of it is that, Aurobindo was such an important person, right? So Aurobindo has passed away, but this is Aurobindo's ashram. This is Aurobindo's project. So in sort of the celebration of creating post-colonial India, celebrating these independence heroes was a really important part of that. So part of it is paying homage to Aurobindo and celebrating the project that he had started there. And the mother and Aurobindo really had this East meets West thing going on, right? Which I don't know, I think is fairly uninteresting at this point in time, but it was like a real product of the moment, right? Where this sort of Orientalist ideas of what the East is meets, same Orientalist ideas of the West, but we can build a bridge between them. And that's what Orville should do. So it's actually like a real binary relationship, but that's how they get the prime ministers there, right? But this continues on. That's why I asked if you mean present or in the past, because Modi went there for the Jubilee, for the 50th anniversary. And this was his first trip to French India, or former French India. So the first trip to Pondicherry was to go to Orville, right? So that's interesting. And he went to the Jubilee and talked about how Orville was exactly what India should be like, right? So you get this real narrative coming out, and it's not just from Modi. It's a very popular narrative that they have done something right. My argument is that they did it by leaving people, by creating this controlled environment where local people couldn't be there, except as workers,
except as workers, yes.
Yeah.
So one of the next questions again, I wanted to ask was about communal ideas, or basically communal aspects between British India and French India. So in continuation to the previous question, the proliferation of Aurobindo and Mother's idea of spiritualism, and how would you place this in the broader picture of communal fruitings happening under British India? And, especially in the 1920s and 30s, there was this time of where communal aspects in British India was taking an extreme, it was taking a very dreadful shape and face. Things in French India seem quite opposite. So if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, French India today has about 1 million people today, right? But it was much smaller then. There's just the populations were not sort of at the level where you saw the divisions going on in other parts of India to a certain extent. There were different things that were dividing people. Some of it was caste based. There was certainly a Muslim population in French India. It was fairly small. And I think there's some people doing some work on that right now. The thing I'll say about it, I guess, is even for just the south of India, right, especially sort of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, it's just a little bit of a different makeup, right? Demographic makeup. So you don't sort of see the kind of politicking around that. Like, it's more about the anti-caste, the anti-Brahmin movement, like the Dravidian politics that are going on in Tamil Nadu at the time, take primacy in terms of what people are thinking about in terms of political discourse. And the other thing I'll say is, around the sort of communal division issue is that after independence, the mother is almost always seen in front of a giant map of undivided India. Like, that's up in the ashram. She says it's apolitical, but you can't tell anyone then sitting in front of a map in front of undivided India is apolitical, right? Especially after 1947. So there's certainly like a stance being taken there, right? In terms of the partition line.
Another idea that I wanted to connect with is how you mentioned in a book about utopianism was or became a colonial impulse. So there continues to be, I don't know, what foundations like Isha, with Sadhguru and the others alike, the kind of run on the side here of creating a utopia. Yeah. Maybe not as, not as clearly pictured as Orville. But this impulse of having a utopia, do you think it is inherently colonial in nature?
I don't think the idea is inherently colonial. I think the practice has been. I think history has shown us that the practice of creating something like a utopian community has tended towards, and what I would call, and I call in the book, I call it settler utopianism in the book, because I'm trying to signal it's not a mercantile colonialism, right? And it's about a colonialism that is all encompassing, which is what a settler colonialism is, right? So it's not quite that project. They're not state projects, although, and I don't do this work, but I think, there is arguments to be made about the USSR and what happens, especially in Central Asia, right? To think about that being a settler colonialism, and certainly around the utopian ideas of communism. But especially in this instance and other ones too, you see them often in the settler colonies, like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, like South Africa, where you have sort of a demographic divide in it, people coming from elsewhere. So it's actually interesting to see in India, right? Because India is not a settler colony at all, right? Like, the British never had enough presence to make that place a settler colony. So it's interesting to see people that are steeped in these narratives of settler colonialism as a heroic pursuit. This is the story of the United States, right, is one of the heroism of settling the West, right, of settling the New World. To see people that grew up with that narrative come to a place like India and then employ it to justify, a better tomorrow without ever thinking about that past of the people right there, right? What happens is, the subjects, the people that live there, are just completely disregarded, right, as sort of non-political actors, right? They're dismissed as people without a history, which is exactly what the colonial project was. You're able to colonize people because you see them as a people without a history. So I think the impulse to say, well, it's paternalistic, right? It's really uses, in this case, the language of sort of 1960s, 1970s development, right, to establish itself, but with this spirituality attached to it. And that's given this sort of pass in a way, because it's seen as something that's going to be for the better good, But that's what colonialism did too, right? It said, I mean, you still get these narratives today. Well, they built the trains, right? So, obviously there was some good there, but it's never a holistic picture, and it never looks at its material consequences.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was about settlers in colonial French India, and what kind of like trying to understand how are they seen, how do they see themselves in that space, and at the same time, what does French India means to France or the French Empire at large? Yeah.
So do you mean now in Orville or in the?
No, just in general, as in colonial France.
Okay.
When India was colonized, so colonial India.
Okay.
What did French India mean to France? Like, because we have this narrative how British India was like the jewel in the crown of England. Like, how was India seen?
Yeah, so I have a few answers to that. I think that's a grest question. So first, I'll just say, the French never had that many people in French India. So there, for me, the settler question's about Orville. It's not about French India. So it was always civil servants, right? It was like people rotating in and out. There were a few families, but it's pretty minimal. Okay, so France, India just has a huge place in the French imagination. And again, I mean, I think this is easily read through, Edward Said's Orientalism, to think about what it meant to have people on the ground doing anthropology, doing philology, like understanding, one of the great books on caste is Louis Dumont's book on caste in India, which is a French anthropologist. So France might not rule in India, but they're producing knowledge about India. And, they actually create sort of a special relationship in the South because of this holding. So you actually can see this in the way the topics the French Academy has sort of chosen to focus on has often been related to South India because of their presence there. So you can always see how the colonial project goes in there. But this idea of France sort of failing in India is really important, actually. It's something that France had sort of had to reckon with. So, if you meet someone, above the age of 60 or so in France, they can recite the 5 French colonies in India to you, because it was part of this like song that people sing at school where they would recite all the areas of the French Empire. Right. So it's, if you have this centuries long rivalry with England, to say like, we are in India too. Right. And France's tourist industry in French India today is very important. Not economically so much. It is in the area, but there's a direct flight from Paris to Chennai. It's like the only direct flight out of Europe that goes to Chennai, right? So to keep this tie, and even Nehru and Aurobindo really talked upon like thinking about what it would look like for French India to be independent, and the question about retaining a French presence in India was really important to people in French India. So they wanted there to be intellectual institutions. So the French Institute of Pondicherry is there today, and that's paid for by the French government. It's like a very well-funded, it's a nice place for research too. And they do all kinds of research, right? They do archaeology and language work and lots of scientific work at the French Institute. So France is still putting quite a bit of money into these institutions. So there's actually several French institutions in Pondicherry today. So, this is part of the negotiation where it's like, well, England's going to sort of forever be our enemy. The question, we haven't talked about Goa, but the Portuguese were still there also, but they were, under a dictatorship. So India wasn't negotiating with them. And this was actually tricky for Nehru because he wanted to create this post-colonial diplomatic relationship with France. Like, it was important, right, to have a good relationship with a strong power in Europe, obviously. And if England's out, France is really the next step, but it was difficult because France, and they also wanted to support independence in Indochina and Algeria, right? And there's actually demonstrations in Pondicherry, mostly by students, against French imperialism in Indochina, and a little less in Algeria because things change. But, so that was something that he had to negotiate a lot of the time there. France is actually important to India, and India is important to France in that sense, that they do want to have these ties with each other. But this just looked different for people who were French Indian a lot of the time, right? Because their sort of desires weren't really taken into account there.
Yeah. Also coming to your last chapter, from the ashram to Orville, in a part of Unmaking, you talk about how utopia is seen as a settlement. Parts of it we've covered through the conversation, but if you could, give us an idea as to this idea of settlement and utopia. What was the connection that the audience can draw? Yeah.
Yeah. Orville founded in 1968, and this is the era of communes, right? 60s counterculture. Communes are starting all over the place. And the reason I call it a settlement, I'm sort of shifting the way we look at it. And this came to me just through reading accounts in the Orville archives of people who were there when it was founded and what the experience of building it was like. And it just read to me like directly as a settler colonial project. Again, not coming from the state, so that is a big difference, but a project of settlement in the sense that they wanted to create something new out of land that was new to them. Right. And that's where the utopianism part comes in too, right? Because you can't create utopia in a land that you already know. Right. And utopias by definition need to be somewhere, it's supposed to be a no place. So they're not supposed to exist. But how do you make a no place? Right. You go to somewhere that is completely foreign to you. Right. And so where the settlement comes in is that the lack of acknowledgement that just because it's not known to you doesn't make it known to anybody. Right. So, it's a question of, yes, they purchased the land, but it's not like they were asking permission to do this project. Right. It's not, there's no acknowledgement that, this land is more than property. Right. That it's part of people's history, that it's part of like people's livelihood, that it's the way that people live day to day. And so, if you bring in new employers, who aren't like technically state colonizers anymore, what does that make them? Right. I also use the word settlement because the people in Orville call themselves pioneers, right? Like this isn't language I'm giving them. They use it themselves, and that's actually why I think it's really important to take people's politics on the face of it. Right. They use this language and it's not self-reflexive at all because I don't think they think there's any problem with it. Right. And again, this has to do with the sort of being raised in the narratives that this is a heroic mission. People say, like, I gave up my family. I gave up, a lot of these people were incredibly privileged people. They had like gone to Harvard. Their families were, wealthy, the wealthy elite of the United States and of Australia and all these places. And so it's like seeing, you drop it all and you go to India. Right. But what are you really giving up? And, it's certainly not for the people in India. I'll tell you that much. It's not, and even when it becomes sort of development projects, they're enclosed. Right. So what it does is sort of it reinscribes this discourse that local people don't know how to take care of the land. Right. So it has nothing, there's no engagement with sort of local caste politics or the politics of dispossession through state means or what happened under the British Empire, right? It's just like, this is the world we live in and we come and we buy the land and then like, we're going to do this and it will benefit you someday because perhaps your children or grandchildren will go to our schools, right? So that's a settlement. That's a settlement, and it's imbued with this sort of spiritual utopianism that comes with it.
Fascinating. Actually, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I kind kind of want to end the conversation with this was your book talks about the decolonization process, and especially about how the bureaucratic process of transferring power was very rarely aligned with the kind of local vision of decolonization. If you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, and especially in this time and space, right? This is about independence. Sometimes that independence is anti-colonial, and sometimes it isn't. It's just about sovereignty, right? If we think about what decolonization means in terms of a bureaucratic process, and that, the word really originates in the late 19th century with bureaucracy, right? It's like, if you're not going to be governed directly anymore, what does that process look like to transfer power? But decolonization really beginning, in the 1950s, but really in the 1960s, especially with the publication of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, becomes this radical process, a project, right? And so it's imbued with a new meaning, especially sort of in the French context, where all these people are fighting liberation movements from Algeria to all the parts of Southern Africa in the 1960s and 70s. So decolonization becomes about something much more, right, than transfer of power. Because if we think about what it means in the Fanonian sense, if we think about what it means for liberation movements that happen a little bit later, it's not about the transfer of power, it's about the dismantling of systems, right? And so in this case, negotiations between France and India are certainly not about the dismantling of systems. It's about the transfer of power. Right. But the people on the ground often were thinking about what it meant to dismantle borders. Right. And I get into this, in some areas of the book with talking about what it meant to have those identity cards. Right. And you have people that are they're fighting for independence. So, they're switching back between Indian and British and French, and they've got all these passports. I don't think this might be in a footnote that M.N. Roy, the founder of the Indian Communist Party, often told people he was French Indian. So, people sort of used it all the time, actually. And this is a way to push back against systems, right? To say it doesn't matter to me, right? So it's not surprising you have a communist saying this, right? That they're sort of eschewing national identity. But that is a way to think about dismantling the system of relating your own personal identity with a nation state, right? Or the idea of a national identity or culture. To say this is a legal document. It's going to get me from point A to point B. I don't have to have this deep devotion to one of these spaces, right? In order to sort of fight for what I want to see in the world. So that looks more like decolonization to me in that sense than transfer of power, right? So these things, the states didn't care about that very much. They weren't interested in that. They were interested in, India was interested in being a powerful state. Right. That's what you want with your sovereignty. Yeah. So, the reason it becomes sort of so pronounced French India is it's this really small space and small disjointed spaces, but they kind of yield a great power. I mean, if you think about these four disparate areas being one federated union, that's actually really rare. Yeah. And interesting. And people there vote, if they are French citizens, they vote in French elections. The consulate comes and they set up voting booths in Pondicherry, and there's politicking that goes on there. So there is the sense of exception, and France actually promoted that, when they wanted people to join the French Union. But they said, if you have these diplomats saying, well, we need to tell the people of French India, if they become part of India, they're just going to get lost. They're no longer special or unique. Right. So you keep this relationship and then say, we're different. It's important to stand out in that sense. And, that has worked actually to a certain extent.
Quite remarkably. So, yeah, it has. So talking about that, how does your work become relevant in understanding contemporary parts of, colonized French colonized India, like current aspects, like how is it relevant?
I think it's just drawing on what I was just talking about. I actually think it's really interesting to think about the people in French India that remain French, that have the passports, that do the voting. A certain amount of them, and there's circulation between France and Pondicherry. It used to be a little bit more because people had served in the military during the wars, and they had pensions, but most, if not all of those people have died now, but their descendants are going back and forth. People people want to marry someone from French India. So there's all kinds of issues related to that. But I think it remains, again, sort of this decolonial move in a way, to say, I'm going to live in French India and be a French citizen, even though I'm like a Tamil speaking, dark-skinned person who may or may not ever go to France. Right. I mean, I just think it's a really interesting subject position to hold. And you have these like French political clubs and people that get really involved in the elections and thinking about the politics of France. And, it gives you, it sort of skews or changes the framework of your relationship to what being Indian is. Because there's no way you can tell those people they're not also Indian, right? Even if the state still, if the state would do a dual citizenship, this would kind of cease to be a problem, actually. But that's not happening. So, it actually is a pushback, especially when we have, a regime in India today that's so all encompassing of what it means to be an Indian, right? And increasingly so with the passing of citizenship laws, the CAA, and increasing amounts of moving to the Hindu right, and making it one thing, and to have these sort of French Indians, and some of their politics are very conservative. The people in French India, I'm not suggesting it's like all some sort of radical leftist movement. It is not at all, but it is a way of sort of saying, like I can be Indian and not be those things at all, right? So it's sort of fascinating to see in that sense.
Yeah. So that brings us to the end of the conversation about the book. But something that I do want to ask you is, what would you suggest to people who want to explore, so one of the things that I've seen, especially when it comes to colonial understanding or colonial legacy in India, a lot is concentrated on British. Quite evidently because of the influence that they've had. But in somewhere, I think the spaces or conversations about French colonial influences and Portuguese colonial influences are kind of suppressed. So for someone who wants to engage themselves in spaces of French colonial India, or maybe just South Asian studies in general, colonial studies in general, what would your suggestions be to someone who's just starting out?
Well, I think in the field of South Asian studies, there is beginning to be a move to look at other parts of South Asia. And, we're still talking about India here, of course, right? So, I hope there's moves to, of course, look at the many, many other regions and places of South Asia too. But I think, and I'll say, I should have maybe said this in your first question about influences. Like, I really think I wrote this book because I am diasporic, right? I think this really comes from my own relationship to India in a lot of spaces, in a lot of ways, my thinking about this, right? Because I grew up in the United States. I was born in Minnesota. I didn't go to India until I was in my 20s, right? So my relationship was very, cultural, but cultural through the diaspora. Right. I think that's a really common experience for people, whether that's in London or whether that is in the Caribbean or whether that is in East Africa. Right. That what you understand about India and what happens then when you have that cultural relationship is that it's pretty static. right? Like you don't because it's like from your parents and your aunts and uncles, and your grandparents, and who have left. You know, I mean, it's a little bit different now because it's so easy to go back and forth, and people can FaceTime and WhatsApp and all these things. So it's, you know, but, you know, I was born in 1979, and it was, you know, we didn't go. It was really expensive. You know, we couldn't all just go to India. You just couldn't do it. So, you know, it was my aunts and uncles came from India, stayed at our house in Minnesota, brought VHS and beta tapes with them of movies. You know, we got them from the Indian grocery store, like going in there with my dad to rent movies. My introduction to Shah Rukh Khan. You know, so all of this comes from there. And, you know, so I was really interested in, you know, like, what is my relationship to this space? And I think people doing sort of diaspora studies related to South Asia is becoming much more, well, maybe not much more, but it's becoming a little more prominent. And I think that's really important in understanding actually these variations, because like, not only do we not talk about French India, we don't talk about French Indians, right? There's, you know, a huge amount of French, not huge, but a significant number of French Indians who live in France. Like, how much do you hear about that diaspora? Right. So there's all these sort of different ways of being South Asian, right? You know, if your grandparents came from Kenya, right, and nobody had lived in India for 3 generations, what's your relationship to it? So I think, you know, if people are interested in this kind of thinking, that's actually a good place to go, is to think about not just South Asia as a static place, but about the diaspora in relationship to it.
Yeah. So any engagements that you would suggest to people who want to engage, like works, books, even podcasts?
For French India, people should read the work of the novelist Henri Gautier. It's Gautier. And his novels are in French, except one was just translated, the Thinnia, Thinnia. So definitely read that. There is a documentarian named Pankaj Kumar, who has made a trilogy about French India. And Two Flags is about sort of these elections that take place in people's relationships. So highly recommend that. I really like some of the work coming out of the diaspora, thinking about the Caribbean and its relationship to this. I really like the book Coolie Woman by Gatra Bahudra. Is that her name? Sorry. I think that's a good one to look at. Pamela Gupta's work on Goa is fantastic. So those are all sort of good places to start, I think.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I make sure that I add them in the description.
Okay.
So before we end the conversation, the last question that we ask everyone is, what is your current project you're working on? What can our listeners and viewers keep an eye out for coming out? Work coming from you? Yeah,
there's 2 things I'm thinking about, and they both really have to do with this utopian question. So one is I'm thinking about both Orville and Chandigarh, of course, the socialist utopian experiment. I want to think about them together as like projects of sort of the same moment, both with French architects, actually, and sort of what their visions of what the future looked like sort of meant for South Asian space. And then I'm working on expanding this settler utopianism concept by looking at other sort of spiritual settlements in South Asia and abroad, sort of led by South Asian spiritualists. To think about what's going on with that.
Yeah, it's a very intriguing, very interesting space to interact with. So thank you so much for joining us on Guftagu, Dr. Jessica, and we were glad to have you on the podcast, and hopefully we get to engage more with your work more often in future.
Often.
Thank you so much for joining it.
Thank you so much, Omar.
Thank you everyone for tuning into this conversation. We really hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and podcast for more such amazing content. There is a series of such amazingly curated interactions with authors and scholars on the history of the subcontinent. Check out our website www.indiacolonized.com for more blogs and podcasts exploring the tales of India's contemporary history. Do follow us on our social media sites for more exciting updates. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.